everyone, I'm Miss Mary Beth. I'm the Youth Services Librarian at Ingalls Memorial Library in Ringe, and I'm here today for Armchair Adventures. And that's our series where every day I read a little bit of a book to you, and eventually we finish a whole book together. And the book we're reading right now is The Princess and the Goblin, and this is written by George MacDonald. And it was written in 1870, and it was written directly for kids. That wasn't the case. A lot of books back then weren't written for kids. And this book is unique because the narrator writes as if he's speaking directly to a group of kids and telling the story. So sometimes he adds his own little thoughts, and it's kind of interesting. But what it's about is this girl Irene is a princess, and she lives in a kingdom where below the ground live a bunch of goblins. They're kind of scary and they come out at night, so Irene can't go out at night. But her friend Curdy is a miner he's 12, and he works in the mines, so he knows about the goblins, and he knows that there's a secret plan against the royal family. So right now, Curdy is out to discover what the secret plan is. And that was where we left off. And that's called Chapter 12, a short chapter about Curdy. Curdy spent many nights in the mine. His father and he had taken Mrs. Peterson into the secret of the plan. For they knew that Mother could hold her tongue, which was more than could be said of the other miners' wives. But Curdy did not tell his mother that every night he spent in the mine, part of it went in earning a new red petticoat for her. Mrs. Peterson was such a good, nice mother. All mothers are nice and good, more or less, but Mrs. Peterson was nice and good all more and no less. She made and kept a little heaven in that poor cottage on the high hillside, for her husband and son to go home to, out of the low and rather dreary earth in which they worked. I doubt if the princess was very much happier, even in the arms of her huge great-grandmother, than Peter and Curdy were in the arms of Mrs. Peterson. True, her hands were hard and chapped and large, but it was with work for them, and, therefore, in the sight of the angels, her hands were so much more beautiful. And if Curdy worked hard to get her a petticoat, she worked hard every day to get him comforts which he would have missed much more than she would a new petticoat even in the winter. Not that she and Curdy ever thought of how much they worked for each other. That would have spoiled everything. So they just help each other because they want to. When left alone in the mine, Curdy always worked on for an hour or two at first, following the lode which, according to Glump, would lead at last into the deserted habitation. After that, he would set out on a reconnoitering expedition. In order to manage this, or rather the return from it, better than the first time, Curdy bought a huge ball of fine string, having learned the trick from the story for kids, Hop on My Thumb. We don't really hear that story anymore, but I guess he follows a ball of string to get him out of trouble. The principle was the same. The end of this string Curdy fastened to his pickaxe, which figured no bad anchor, and then, with the ball in his hand, he unrolled it as he went, and he set out in the dark through the natural gangs of the goblins' territory. The first night or two, Curdy came upon nothing worth remembering. He saw only a little of the home life of the cobs in the various caves they called houses. He failed in coming upon anything to cast light upon the foregoing design, which kept the inundation for the present in the background. But at length, I think on the third or fourth night, Curdy found, partly guided by the noise of their implements, a company of evidently the best sappers and miners amongst them, hard at work. What were they about? It could not well be the inundation, seeing that that had in the meantime been postponed to something else. Then what was it? He lurked and watched, every now and then in the greatest risk of being detected, but without success. He had again and again to retreat in haste, a proceeding rendered the more difficult that he had to gather up his string as he returned upon his course. It was not that he was afraid of the goblins, but that he was afraid of their finding out that they were watched, which might have prevented the discovery at which he aimed. Sometimes his haste had to be such that, when he reached home towards morning, his string, for lack of the time to wind it up as he dodged the goblins, would be in what seemed the most hopeless entanglement. But after a good sleep, though a short one, Curdy always found his mother had got the string right again. There it was, wound in the most respectable ball, ready for use the moment he should want it. "I can't think how you do it, Mother," he would say. "I follow the thread," she would answer, "just as you do in the mine." His mother never had more to say about it, but the less clever she was with her words, the more clever she was with her hands, and the less his mother said, the more Curdy believed that she had to say. But still he made no discovery as to what the goblin miners were about. And that is the end of a short chapter about Curdy. Chapter 13 is called The Cob's Creatures. Remember, cobs is another word for goblins. About this time, the gentlemen whom the king had left behind him to watch over the princess had each occasion to doubt the testimony of his own eyes. For more than strange were the objects to which they would bear witness. They were of one sort, creatures, but so grotesque and misshapen as to be more like a child's drawing upon his paper than anything natural. The guards saw the creatures only at night, while on guard about the house. The testimony of the man who first reported having seen one of them was that, as he was walking slowly around the house, while yet in the shadow, he caught sight of a creature standing on its hind legs in the moonlight, with its forefeet upon a window ledge, staring in at the window. Its body might have been that of a dog or a wolf, he thought, but he declared on his honor that its head was twice the size it ought to have been, for the size of its body, and was as round as a ball, while the face, which it turned upon him as it fled, was more like one carved by a boy upon the turnip inside which he is going to put a candle than anything else the guard could think of. The creature rushed into the garden. The guard sent an arrow after it, and he thought he must have struck it, for it gave an unearthly howl, and he could not find his arrow any more than he could find the beast, although he searched all about the place where the beast had vanished. They laughed at him until he was driven to hold his tongue, and they said he must have taken too long a drink at the ale jug. But before 2 nights were over, he had he had a guard to side with him, for the guard too had seen something strange, only quite different from that reported by the other. The description the second man gave of the creature he had seen was yet more grotesque and unlikely. They were both laughed at by the rest, but night after night another came over to their side, until at last there was only one left to laugh at all his companions. 2 nights more passed, and he saw nothing, but on the 3rd night he came rushing from the garden to the other 2 before the house, in such an agitation that they declared, for it was their turn now, that the band of his helmet was cracking under his chin with the rising of his hair inside it. Running with him into that part of the garden which I have already described, the guards saw a score of creatures, to not one of which they could give a name, and not one of which was like another, hideous and ludicrous at once, gambolling on the lawn in the moonlight. The supernatural, or rather subnatural, ugliness of their faces, the length of legs and necks in some, the apparent absence of both or either in others, made the spectators, although in one consent as to say what they saw, yet doubtful, as I have said, of the evidence of their own eyes, and ears as well, for the noises the creatures made, although not loud, were as uncouth and varied as their forms, and could be described neither as grunts, nor squeaks, nor roars, nor howls, nor barks, nor yells, nor screams, nor croaks, nor hisses, nor meows, nor squeaks, or anything, but only as something like all of them mingled into one horrible sound. Keeping in the shade, the guards had a few moments to recover themselves before the hideous assembly suspected their presence. But all at once, as if by common consent, they scampered off in the direction of a great rock, and they vanished before the men had come to themselves sufficiently to think of following them. My readers will suspect what these were, but I will now give them full information concerning the creatures. They were, of course, household animals belonging to the goblins, whose ancestors had taken their ancestors many centuries before from the upper regions of light into the lower regions of darkness. The original stocks of these horrible creatures were very much the same as the animals now seen about farms and homes in the country, with the exception of a few of them, which had been wild creatures such as foxes, and indeed wolves and small bears, which the goblins, from their proclivity towards the animal creation, had caught when cubs were tamed. But in the course of time, all had undergone even greater changes than had passed upon their owners. The animals had altered, that is, their descendants had altered, into such creatures as I have not attempted to describe except in the vaguest manner, the various parts of their bodies assuming, in an apparently arbitrary and self-willed manner, the most abnormal developments. Indeed, so little did any distinct type predominate in some of the bewildering results, that you could only have guessed at any known animal as the original, and even then, what likeness remained would be more one of the general expression than of definable confirmation. But what increased the gruesomeness tenfold was that, from constant domestic, or indeed rather family association with the goblins, their countenances had grown in grotesque resemblance to the human. Ooh. No one understands animals who does not see that every one of them, even amongst the fishes, it may be with a dimness and vagueness infinitely remote, yet shadows the human. In the case of these, the human resemblance had greatly increased. While their owners had sunk towards them, they had risen toward their owners, but the conditions of subterranean life being equally unnatural for both, while the goblins were worse, the creatures had not improved by the approximation, and this result would have appeared far more ludicrous than consoling to the warmest lover of animals. I shall now explain how it was that just then these animals began to show themselves about the king's country house. The goblins, as Curly had discovered, were mining on, at work both day and night, in divisions, urging the scheme after which he lay in wait. In the course of their tunneling, they had broken into the channel of a small stream, but the break being on the top of it, no water had escaped to interfere with their work. Some of the creatures, hovering as they often did about their masters, had found the hole, and had, with a curiosity which had grown into a passion from the restraints of their unnatural circumstances, proceeded to explore the channel. The stream was the same which ran out by the seat on which Irene and her king papa had sat as I have told, and the goblin creatures found it jolly fun to get out for a romp on a smooth lawn, such as they had never seen in all their poor, miserable lives. But although they had partaken enough of the nature of their owners to delight in annoying and alarming any of the people whom they met on the mountain, they were, of course, incapable of designs of their own, or of intentionally furthering those of their masters. For several nights after the men-at-arms were at length of one mind as to the fact of the visits of some horrible creatures, whether bodily or spectral they could not yet say, they watched with special attention that part of the garden in which they had last seen them. Perhaps, indeed, they gave in consequence too little attention to the house, but the creatures were too cunning to be easily caught, nor were the watchers quick-eyed enough to descry the head or the keen eyes with it, from the opening whence the stream issued. They would watch them in turn, ready, the moment they should leave the lawn, to report the place clear. And that is the end of chapter 13. Those things sound really spooky. I don't ever want to run across one of those. This next chapter is called Chapter 14, That Night Week. During the whole of the week, Irene had been thinking every other moment of her promise to the old lady, although even now she could not quite feel sure that she had not been dreaming. Could it really be that an old lady lived in the top of the house, with pigeons and a spinning wheel, and a lamp that never went out? She was, however, none the less determined, on the coming Friday, to ascend the 3 stairs, walk through the passages with the many doors, and try and find the tower in which she had either seen or dreamed of her grandmother. Remember, she met the old lady, and she told her to come back on Friday? She's going to. Her nurse could not help wondering what had come of the child. She would sit so thoughtfully silent, and, even in the midst of a game with her, would so suddenly fall into a dreamy mood. But Irene took care to betray nothing, whatever efforts Ludi might make to get at her thoughts, as Ludi had to say to herself, "What an odd child she is," and she gave up. At length, the longed-for Friday arrived, and lest Ludi should be moved to watch her, Irene endeavored to keep herself as quiet as possible. In the afternoon she asked for her doll's house, and went on arranging and rearranging the various rooms and their inhabitants for a whole hour. Then she gave a sign and threw herself back in her chair. One of the dolls would not sit, and another would not stand, and they were all very tiresome. Indeed, there was one who would not even lie down, which was too bad. But it was now getting dark, and the darker it got, the more excited Irene became, and the more she felt it necessary to be composed. "I see you want your tea, princess," said the nurse. "I will go and get it. The room feels small. I will open the window a little. The evening is mild. It won't hurt you." "There's no fear of that, Ludi," said Irene, wishing she could put off going for tea till it was darker, when she might have made her attempt with every advantage. I fancy Ludi was longer in returning than she had intended, for when Irene, who had been lost in thought, looked up, she saw it was nearly dark, and at the same moment she caught sight of a pair of eyes, bright with a green light, glowering at her through the open window. The next instant something leaped into the room. It was like a cat, with legs as long as a horse's, Irene said, but its body was no bigger and its legs no thicker than those of a cat. She was too frightened to cry out, but not too frightened to jump from her chair and run from the room. Whew. It was plain enough to every one of my readers what she ought to have done, and indeed Irene thought of it herself. But when she came to the foot of the old stair, just outside the nursery door, she imagined the creature running up those long ascents after her, and pursuing her through the dark passages, which, after all, might lead to no tower. That thought was too much. Irene's heart failed her, and, turning from the stairs, she rushed along the hall, whence, finding the front door open, she darted into the court, pursued, at least she thought so, by the creature. No one happening to see her, she ran on, unable to think for fear, and ready to run anywhere to elude the awful creature with the stilt legs. Not daring to look behind her, Irene rushed straight out of the gate and up the mountain. It was foolish indeed, thus to run farther and farther from all who could help her, as if she had been seeking a fit spot for the goblin creature to eat her in its leisure. But that is the way fear serves us. It always sides with the thing we are afraid of. The princess was soon out of breath with running uphill, but she ran on, for she fancied the horrible creature just behind her, forgetting that, had it been after her, such long legs as those must have overtaken her long ago. At last she could run no longer, and she fell, unable even to scream, by the roadside, where she lay for some time half dead with terror. But finding nothing to lay hold of her, and her breath beginning to come back, she ventured at length to get up and peer anxiously about her. It was now so dark that she could see nothing. Not a single star was out. She could not even tell in what direction the house lay, and between her and home she fancied the dreadful creature lying ready to pounce upon her. She saw now that she ought to have run up the stairs at once. It was well she did not scream, for although very few of the goblins had come out for weeks, a stray idler or two might have heard her. She sat down upon a stone, and nobody but one who had done something wrong could have been more miserable. She had quite forgotten her promise to visit her grandmother. A raindrop fell on her face. Irene looked up, and for a moment her terror was lost in astonishment. At first she thought the rising moon had left her place, and drawn night to see what would be the matter with the little girl. But soon Irene was mistaken, for there was no light on the ground at her feet, and no shadow anywhere. But a great silver globe was hanging in the air, and as she gazed at the lovely thing, her courage revived. If she were but indoors again, she would fear nothing, not even the terrible creature with the long legs. But how was she to find her way back? What could that light be? No, it couldn't be. But what if it should be? Yes, it must be. It must be her great-grandmother's lamp. She jumped up. She had to see that light in view, and she must find the house. Irene's heart grew strong. Speedily, yet softly, she walked down the hill, hoping to pass the creature unseen. Dark as it was, there was little danger now of choosing the wrong road. And, which was the most strange, the light that filled her eyes from the lamp, instead of blinding them for a moment to the object upon which they fell next, you know how that happens, they enabled her to see. By looking at the lamp and then dropping her eyes, she could see the road for a yard or two in front of her, and this saved her from several falls, for the road was very rough. But all at once, to her dismay, the light vanished, and the terror of the beast which had left her the moment she began to return, again lay hold of her heart. The same instant, however, Irene caught the light of the windows and knew exactly where she was. It was too dark to run, but she made with what haste she could, and she reached the gate in safety. She found the house door still open. She ran through the hall, and without even looking to the nursery, she bounded straight up the stairs, and the next, and then turning to the right, she ran through the long avenue of silent rooms, and she found her way at once to the door at the foot of the tower stair. When first the nurse missed her, she fancied she was playing her a trick, and for some time took no trouble about her. But at last, getting frightened, she had begun to search. And when the princess entered, the whole household was hither and thither all over the house, hunting for Irene. A few seconds after she reached the stair of the tower, they even began to search the neglected rooms, in which they never would have even thought of looking, had they not already searched every other place they could think of in vain. But by this time, Irene was knocking at the old lady's door. And that is the end of chapter 14. Thanks for reading with me. What do you think is going to happen? What do you think the old lady's going to do to Irene? Do we like the old lady? I don't know. Let's find out tomorrow for more Armchair Adventures. Thanks for reading with me.